I obey in order to be accepted, but in a relationship with Jesus, I'm accepted, therefore I obey, and those are significant differences. And even though we know that, as evangelicals, as the Christian church in America, we still bring about the rules. Tell me I'm wrong if I say most of us have an expectation for you to be converted. You have to say a thing called the sinner's prayer, and you have to say it a certain way at a certain time and be able to tell me when and how you did that. Like, some of us like, no, Phil, that's weird, but other of us go like, yeah, maybe I kind of fall into that boat. And here's the thing that I will say, you can't have a relationship with Jesus without acknowledging him as Lord and Savior. You do have to invite him. But like a standard of words in a certain order and said at a certain time, I know of multiple people who met Jesus and invited him into their life while swearing. Like, that happened. And I've met evangelicals who were like, well, that shouldn't happen. Do you know our very own campus at Easter a few years ago, I said, he is risen, and the congregation said, hell yeah? That happened at Lakeview. And I shared that with some of my friends, and like, well, as long as they don't stay that way. I'm like, well, they probably won't, but that's not the standard we measure by, which leads me to the next point of who's in and who's out. So somebody gets saved, and suddenly we're like, okay, you're saved now. Now you have to change how you behave to be more like us and do it this way. We do that. Do we not have people that walk through our lives that are a little unsavory, that sometimes they're a little different, that their viewpoints don't line up with mine, and then they become a believer and like, okay, sweet, now they're not going to be weird anymore. That's what the church does in America. A Christian should look like this, and now that you've been saved, fix everything, you dummy. And in Romans, that's what was going on. And Paul, this is the third point, Paul wrote this letter to correct that, amongst other things. Who are believers and how do they live? Well, they're saved by Jesus, and that's a significant piece. The problem is, the world tells us to live a certain way, and Christianity, at least in the evangelical circles in America, has, unfortunately, maybe we've gotten away from religion because we understand Jesus, but then we create club Christianity. Here's your membership card, here's how you behave. And if you're not careful, the HOA club president is going to kick you out. Now, on a side note, I didn't say this in first service, but I will acknowledge it now. The only two places where people who can't get power anywhere else in life go to get power is the local church and the HOA. That says something. All right, serious question. Are we unified by the gospel or divided by our worldviews? So, in light of what I just said of who's in and who's out, how do we decide of who's in and who's out? Well, we decide that this is the right way to do worship. And if you agree with me, you're in. If you don't, you're out. Like, to do worship right, it has to have a band. No, to do worship right, it shouldn't have a band. It should be like a hymn and an organ. Like, that's how it's supposed to be. To do worship right, we have to go to a church where the pastor speaks out of a certain Bible and teaches a certain way, uses Hebrew and Greek, so I'm super confused, makes me feel really guilty, so I leave confused and feel stupid. Like, that's deep. That's what we kind of want from a church. Like, and if you don't accept that, then you're out. Or you're in. Depends on where you're coming from. That is the worship experience that we fall into. Sunday mornings fall into that too. Everybody walks in with this opinion of how the church service is supposed to be. And, you know, multiple people have come here and said, Phil, this is how a church should be. And I'm going like, cool, you find that church and tell me how it goes. Because I will openly admit, we don't have a clue what we're doing here half the time. We have Jesus, and that's where we go. And that's what we're trying, and we mess it up on a regular basis. But we are the church. We don't do church. But it still is a problem. You need to fit in a certain way. How about this one? You're in or you're out based on politics. It was actually really nice not being the pastor of a group of people during this political season. One of my favorite moments was the next day I was asked, Phil, what did you think of the results? And I was like, they were fantastic. Winnipeg beat Utah 6-1. It was an amazing hockey game. And it was both of my favorite teams. Unfortunately for Utah, it was like a cat playing with the mouse, you know, like playing with its food. But it was a hockey game that I really enjoyed. See, I'm back first day. Hockey's already in the mix. But when it comes to politics, we look at these beliefs, and there's a problem because we'll meet a Christian who's become a believer, and now it's like, no, you need to vote and think and be a certain way. And I struggle with that because that would tell me that your political view is guiding your gospel view and not the other way around. something we need to learn as people. It is okay to love God and love your country. That's okay. I can love my wife and love my daughter in that order with appropriateness. And that's how I see politics. Politics is like my daughter. If that ever gets in the way of my God, as my daughter was getting in the way of my wife, I need to make some corrections. But when people come in who think differently than me, there's an in and out mentality. And this is a problem. Because we look at what Jesus did, and he did something completely different for us. And when people walk in, there's a different experience. Now today, as we're digging in, we're going to see both this concept of people who are sinners and this idea of how we deal with sin. So let's start with Romans 14, verse 1. We'll jump ahead here, Lauren. It says, accept other believers who are weak in faith. Now that's going to be key. And don't argue with them about what they think is right or wrong. Why? If you're from first of all, if you're from a religious background, that's kind of hard. But what about the rules, Phil? They're sinning. Shouldn't I tell them they're sinning? My answer to that is maybe. Have you earned the right to? Do they trust you? Are you the representation of Jesus that they have decided to say, can you help me see where I need to go? Or are you just looking at them and saying, what you're doing is stupid and you need to fix it in order to fit in my church? The fact is, weak in faith is actually talking about like they're not weak people, but they're just figuring out this Jesus thing. It's new to them. Or they haven't fully accepted Jesus yet, but they're interested and they're intrigued and they're looking. And they want to know who he is. Well, in that particular moment, there is a chance that their language might be a little unsavory to the church person. Swear words, bleeding ears. There's a chance that some of their lifestyle choices are not what we would consider to be the right Christian lifestyle. And don't get me wrong, as Jesus leads us, our lifestyle does change. But when we're first walking through the door and we're weak in faith, do you think that they have the same standard that we do? No. Point number 1, meeting Jesus is the beginning of the life transformation that God wants for us. Key word there, beginning. Well, hey, let me tell you, sir, now that you've accepted Jesus, all of your bad habits, we're going to break them right now, 180 degrees. We're going to fix it immediately. Husbands and wives, when you got married, was your spouse perfect? Or is it taking years of plotting to try and fix them? That's a joke, because that's not what we're supposed to do. It doesn't even have to be in a marriage situation. You have a friend who you care about, and as you've got to know them in the beginning, they might have been a little weird in some areas, and you're like, yeah, I'll tolerate this for a season, but if they don't fix it, they're out. We do that with Christianity as people. These people come in, they have these life experience and worldviews that they came in with, but they don't disappear overnight. This is what was happening in Rome. You had these different people who became believers, who found the truth of the gospel, they found freedom, they found joy, and then they had these different rules about what it meant to follow Jesus. And you're either in or out if you follow whose rules? My rules. At the end of the day, when we think about how church is supposed to be, how worship is supposed to be, is it about God or is it about me? I promise you it's not about God. As Jesus invites us to come to the cross, to the throne of heaven, broken, bleeding, and hurt, as we are, anytime, anyway. And then somehow we decided, no. Change your clothes before you go in. You put on your churchy clothes first. Oh, your hair like that? Looks like you just got out of bed. You got to fix that. Yes, I did grow my hair out with my sabbatical. I actually was trying to decide if I cut it before this morning or not, but it was such hard work, so gotta keep it going. Corey, you get that, right? For those you don't know, he's our worship guy over here, little shiny one. All right, let's keep going. I'm getting out of hand here. Romans 14:2-3. For instance, one person believes it's all right to eat anything, but another believer with sensitive conscience, will eat only vegetables. Those who feel free to eat anything must not look down on those who don't. And those who don't eat certain foods must not condemn those who do. God has accepted them. We still deal with this today. You know, the vegan, the vegetarian, the carnivore, they're all kind of annoying. I kind of joke about that, and you go like, well, Phil, that seems kind of ridiculous. It's just food. But hold on, let's other side who are people who didn't have any restrictions, and they met Jesus, and they're like, what is your problem? Now, here's the funny thing. Gentiles and the Jews in the same Christian church are looking at each other and saying, your lifestyle is way wrong, and you need to fix this to hang out with Jesus. And unfortunately, we haven't stopped. Your lifestyle is way wrong, and you need to fix it in order to be here with Jesus. We haven't stopped doing that, friends. It's something that we carry on with. And I again, will see everybody else and everything else exists to worship the God of self. You exist for my pleasure, for my honor, and if you're not, I have no interest in you. Sin is a bad. People walk through the doors, they stop being sinners. And here's a guarantee. I can guarantee this. Every single person that walked through the doors is in people's lives, and there are many areas. It's both food and alcohol. And he said he had a friend that one time that said, you know, overeating is as bad as alcoholism. And the comedian says, this was my favorite part. He said, you know what? You got a point there, because when I was young, my brother and I were doing great until my dad had one too many patty melts. Right? The sin is when we cross the line. Because when we're living in sin, we are dishonoring God, worshiping ourselves, and we're often hurting other people. But when we have a sinner in our midst whose lifestyle is different than ours, we're not the master to judge them. Let's look at the next verse. Romans 14:4. Who are you to condemn someone else's servants? We are servants of the master of who God is. God is our master. We are his servants. Their own master will judge whether they stand or fall. Same for us. And with the Lord's help, this is pretty important. With the Lord's help, they will stand and receive his approval. Maybe they don't have it dialed in right now, but I don't have it dialed in right now, and neither do you. And if, we're not familiar with the master servants culture that existed there, but that's what they had. But what we can connect with is, as we're looking around the room, that person's different than me and not doing a good job, and therefore they don't belong here. We can relate to that. And Paul's attacking that idea. Next verse. In the same way, some think one day is more holy than the other day. Why? Because they were formerly Jews and they had a Sabbath and it was a specific day. While others think every day is alike, Gentiles who never had those laws. You should be fully convinced that whichever day you choose is acceptable. Now that's interesting. Well, why? What's going on? Their worldviews were so different, and when your worldview is in charge, you actually can't cross this line. In fact, I see this today. And let's be very clear. Love and acceptance does not equal affirmation. Those are very different. I can love and accept you and disagree with you. You can love and accept me and disagree with me. We do it all the time. When we start believing that if you don't affirm my view, you don't love me, that becomes problematic. I have some friends who don't believe in God. They do not affirm the very God of my universe who makes me who I am, but yet they still love and accept me. Why can't difference is I hide mine because they're respectable sins. Thanksgiving is coming up. Did you know that gluttony is a sin? No, Phil, that's an appetizer. That's what you eat before you eat, so that makes you more hungry. Starving kids in Africa? Well, Lord, thank you for the pilgrims who came here to America so I can eat this abundance of turkey and green jello and mashed potatoes with marshmallow stuff on them. I'm not joking. It's a sin to be a gluttonous person. But because we've decided that it's socially acceptable, that's okay. You see where I'm going with this? And who does it hurt? Well, ultimately it hurts me, because at 42 years old, it's getting harder and harder to skate up and down the ice. Or I should say, at least all the other guys are going faster. This also means, when we read that point, never expect a new believer to have a knowledge of a seasoned believer. They're going to have a different conviction than you. Like, their conviction this Sunday may be like, just show up to church, just make it to church. And then they do, and their hair is a mess, and they're wearing the wrong colors, and they have maybe the wrong language, and they just made it to church, and then somebody says, you showed up like that? That becomes a problem. Let's continue. Romans 14:7-9. For we don't live for ourselves or die for ourselves. This is a reminder that there's an eternity thing on here going on. If we live, it's to honor the Lord. Like he says, if we live. Also another guarantee, every one of us is going to die. What's your 10,000-year investment? What are you investing in that's going to go beyond this life? And I don't mean like the legacy that your kids and grandkids are just going to like murder into the ground. I mean the one that we get to participate with in eternity. Jesus is tackling this like, what are you destroying now that has an eternal impact? Because this person's a new believer and their soul is at risk when they're the new believer. Babies are the ones who need milk and care and nurture, and yet they're the ones that we push out because they haven't met up to the standard that we expect of them. And if we die, it's to honor the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. Christ died and rose again for this very purpose, to be the Lord of both living and the dead. And he says this because he's trying to make a point, and this is point number 2. Christ's death was to unite us with him, and the gospel brings unity, not division. And you're like, yeah, but Phil, that person's super weird. They're uncomfortable. They politically think differently than me. They do these things where they watch these movies that they're not okay. Their jokes are terrible. Like, okay, well, God's still working on them. Confession. I love off-color jokes. I'm like, well, that's not okay. You're a pastor. I'm like, well, they're still funny. You know what? Here's the thing, though. Jesus has worked on me somewhat, and now I at least have somewhat of a filter and discernment to say, this is probably not the group of people to share that joke, Phil. And it works some of the time. Continuing, Romans 14:10, he just said, Jesus died for us, paid the price for us, and then he says this, so why do you condemn another believer? Why do you look down on another believer? It's just saying believer. It's not saying where they're at in their faith. They're a believer. Could be brand new. Could be really old. Because here's the other thing. If you're a new believer, I'm also not giving you an excuse to judge the old believers. And I'm not necessarily saying age. I'm saying time with Jesus. Well, they're old and stuffy. Well, yeah, but you haven't walked the life that they've walked to know how they got where they are. Why do you look down on another believer? Remember, this is key. We will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For the scriptures say, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow to bend and will bend to me. Every tongue will declare allegiance to God. Yes, each of us will give a personal account to God. So let's stop condemning each other. Decide instead to live in such a way that you will not cause another believer to stumble and fall. You ever think about your actions that way? You're with another Christian, and maybe you do something that hurts them, and you don't realize it. They'll be okay. But then you stop and think, I'm going to stand before God and have to hold account for that. You know, here's a hard one. Ephesians chapter 5, it says men are supposed to lead, ladies are supposed to submit, and you can say, Phil, that's a context thing. I disagree. That's what the Bible says. Men, you know that we are going to stand accountable for our lack of leadership and how pathetic we've been? Ladies aren't responsible for that. Ladies, do you realize that you're going to have to hold an account for the Lord on your part? Your husband's not responsible for that, or the man's not responsible for that. Or if you're not married, it doesn't even matter. You will be held account to how you treat people. Whether it was like if you're a teenager, how you treated someone like, no, it's adult time. We're doing tough theology. We're doing deep Bible study. Your kids are annoying. Go away. And Jesus says, hold on. This is what he says, Matthew 14:19. Jesus said, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Now, in his case, he was making a point on two levels. One, he's saying, let these little children come because they come with a level of innocence and don't get in their way. But he's also saying those that are such as these, he's talking about the weak believer in his faith. And here's the problem. We as Christians want what we want out of our Sunday morning experience, that we forget that there are those who don't know Jesus yet, are trying to meet Jesus, and we're getting in the way. Have you ever thought about that? My worship method can sometimes get in the way of somebody meeting Jesus. Have we ever thought about that? That me as a Christian, my convictions actually can get in the way of somebody meeting Jesus because I submit to myself first and I'm mad at them because they're different, instead of asking the Lord how he wants me to handle this situation. And that can be hard. I meet with people who their worldviews and their faith views are all over the map. And then they tell me that this is the truth, Phil, this is the truth. And I'm sitting here going like, I have no idea what you're talking about or where you got that from. But in that moment, do I correct them and say you're stupid? No, because what's going to happen? They're going to leave. My relationship with them is over and I've represented Jesus poorly. But you know what happens instead of that? You have to do this, I have to do this. We walk with them through weeks, months, years of this relationship, and they end up seeing who Jesus is in our lives because we represent Jesus to them in a regular daily experience that they watch. And suddenly they stop seeing us and they start seeing Jesus. And it doesn't happen when they're the little children. We say, no, big kids here only, get to the back. Now, when it comes to Christianity, let me tell you something. You know what's cool about kids as adults? I can see over their heads. And I can worship Jesus anytime, any place, anywhere, anyhow, because he doesn't stop being God. Well, so I don't get to use my preferred method in this moment. I will sacrifice my preferred method so that they can meet Jesus. Now, how does that play out here practically? Lakeview says you can belong before you believe. Some Christians are like, that's scary, Phil. I'm not saying they belong to the kingdom of Christ until they accept Jesus. I'm saying they can hang out with us while they're figuring it out. And we do different things in our church, Sunday morning experience, to help them connect with Jesus. That's deliberate and intentional. And point number 3 is this. We need to not get in the way, but show the way. And sometimes we have to clear the way. One of the hardest things I've done in our church is ask Christians to go find another church. Why? Because when they come here, it's like, no, this is what my worship experience has to be. I don't care if it's uncomfortable for this person who's walked into our church for the first time. And I didn't kick him out. I just said, hey, would it be all right if you weren't doing this thing in our church service, because the people that are visiting us, the guests that are visiting us, are freaked out by that. Like, you can do that. It's not wrong. It's a perfectly fine way to worship Jesus. Just for this 1 hour, well, not even an hour, this period of time, can you just put that aside so this person has an easier way of getting to the throne of Jesus? More times than not, they say, no, you're not a biblical church, and you're a stupid pastor. I'm like, yeah, that's probably true. Not the biblical part. I believe we're a very biblical church, but stupid pastor, sometimes. I already told you I got the dirty joke thing going on. Romans 14:22-23. This is key. This is the sin part. How do we deal with sin? You may believe there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, but keep it between yourself and God. I have freedom. Jesus isn't convicting me about that anymore. I live freely in that. We talked about alcohol. You don't have a conviction about this, so you have a drink once in a while with dinner. Cool. Do you know who's struggling with alcohol in your life right now in this room? No. So maybe in that case, until you feel otherwise, keep it to yourself. That's an example. I'm not saying that is the way to behave. I'm just saying that is a possible example. Now, what Jesus is not saying is, through Paul, he's not saying, hey, if you've decided that murder is okay, just keep that between yourself. He's talking about things that are biblically lined up here. God is not going to say this blatant sin is okay. Jesus is going to say, I paid for that, and I'm going to lead you out of that. But in my timing, not necessarily yours. So there's not permission to go be a blatant sinning person. Then he says this, blessed are those who don't feel guilty for doing something they have decided is right. That's key. We'll get to that in a second. But if you have doubts about whether or not you should eat something or you are sinning, if you go ahead and do it, for you are not following your convictions. say it might be worth taking this to the Lord. Blessed are those who don't feel guilty for doing something they have decided is right. This is not the moment where you're like people who say it's not wrong, then it's going to be okay. Guys, you know this is true. I know this is true. When I'm sinning, I know it. A new believer, when they're sinning and Jesus starts convicting them, they start understanding it too. They don't need us coming at them with a giant bludgeon object to smash them over the head and say, stop sinning. They know just as well as you do the sin that Jesus is removing in their life in this time, in this place, in this moment. And that actually is important for us to understand. You know that Jesus is working on a certain sin in your life right now? And it's probably not the same sin he was working on 5 years ago. That's true all the time. He's transforming us. He's changing us. Let's, band coming up. I'm going to run down these last three when in Rome, when representing Christ in the world statements. And we've done this with each message. But it's something that we need to learn and that we can apply. So the first one, here's the truth. I will live my life around and with people that see the world differently than me. What makes it a church and not a club is that there's lots of different messy people about. When there's a club, you stop people at the door you don't want in. That is not the bride of Christ. There are all kinds that Jesus invites in. And there are all kinds of people who reject that too. But that doesn't mean we reject it, because Jesus never does. Whether they believe or not, Jesus is working on them. It's our job to walk with them and keep representing Jesus to them. Maybe someday they'll give us the opportunity to be the person they seek guidance from, or ask questions to. It doesn't have to be me because I have the title pastor. It could be you. But have you walked with somebody long enough to represent Jesus to them? Now you're the person they go to. Here's an unfortunate thing for you. There's not a single Christian who's exempt from the Great Commission to go make disciples. You're breathing as a believer. You're supposed to be earning the right to be heard and give people the opportunity to see Jesus in you. The next one, I need to get out of the way of their path to Jesus. There's nothing more sad than a new believer who comes to meet Jesus and then gets kicked out of the church because they don't fit in. They're not the right mold. They're not the right pedigree. I'm proud of you guys that doesn't happen here. Well, I guess it could that I don't know about. Like, there are probably sometimes we miss the mark. But overall, I do feel like, and if you're one of those people who's not a believer, we're glad you're here with us. You're welcome to come in here and kick the tires and try and figure things out. I would gladly be your friend if you're okay with disagreeing with me, and I'm okay with disagreeing with you. That's perfectly fine. But there are churches where the person comes in, they're a new believer, they don't have the right Sunday clothes on, they don't know the right Bible verses, they have the wrong Bible translation, and they get thrown aside. And who looks bad, the church or God? God does. I need to get out of the way of their path to Jesus. The last one, I need to follow my convictions when God is leading me away from sin. You know when you're sinning. You do. At least you always do in hindsight. Call me on Friday after Thanksgiving dinner. Well, don't call me. I don't want to hear about it, because then I also have to tell you how I probably overate too. We need to stop trying to hide these things and justify them, and just turn them over to the Lord. I promise you, when it comes to sin, you're worshiping yourself. You're turning away from God, and in the process, you're going to hurt somebody, intentionally or unintentionally. This is not a message to say, go ahead and accept sin. That person's a sinner. Let him get away with it. Well, no. Lead them to Jesus by how you behave, by how you act. And maybe leading them to Jesus, if you've earned the right because you now know who they are, is telling them verbally right now. But you know that because you spent time with them to know how they react and how their personality is. Because you've spent the time with them, you know that person can't handle that verbal assault at this moment, and you know that it's going to take probably months to years of you investing in their life for them to hear what Jesus is trying to say to them. This is it. This is the bottom line. Wrap it up this way. When in Rome, as the Romans do,